In 1963, Rover built a car so advanced it terrified its own mechanics. This wasn't a supercar. It wasn't a racing machine. It was a family saloon built for doctors and bank managers. And hidden underneath its ordinary skin was engineering nobody in Britain had put into a mainstream car before. Disc brakes on all four wheels at a time when most cars still relied on drums. A rear suspension system torn straight out of motorsport. And a way of building the body itself that no repair shop in the country had ever encountered. Every single one of those innovations came with a hidden cost. A job as simple as changing a rear brake pad could turn into a nightmare that took an entire afternoon apart. The car that redefined what a British saloon could be also became, for the people who had to keep it running, one of the most complicated cars in the country. And within a year of launch, this strange, brilliant machine would do something almost nobody predicted. It would beat Mercedes-Benz outright on merit in front of the whole of Europe. This is the story of the Rover P6, the car built to be the smartest thing on the road, and how being that smart nearly became its downfall. Before 1963, a British family car looked the same as it had for decades. Simple, predictable, a separate chassis with a body bolted on top, drum brakes all round, a live rear axle doing the same job it had done since before the war. Rover itself was part of that old world. Founded in the 19th century, by the 1950s it had built a reputation as the car of the establishment. Solid, dependable, thoroughly unexciting. The kind of car a bank manager bought because it was exactly what a bank manager was supposed to drive. But inside Rover's engineering department, a small team led by designers Spen King, Gordon Bashford and David Bache had grown restless with that reputation. They didn't want to build the next dependable Rover. They wanted to build something that would force the entire industry to sit up. Work on what would become the P6 began as early as 1956, 7 years before it ever reached a showroom. Bache's vision for the styling was described as a simple classical form, devoid of all superfluous ornament, no unnecessary flourishes, every line doing a job. And underneath that clean, restrained shape, the engineering team was about to throw out almost everything Rover had ever built a car around. The first thing to go was the chassis itself. Every conventional British saloon at the time used a separate frame with a body bolted onto it. Rover replaced that entirely with something they called a base unit, a structural skeleton frame that the outer body panels simply attached to rather than supported. On paper, it sounds like a manufacturing detail. In reality, it was a complete rethink of how a car should be built. It meant Rover could redesign the P6's styling across its production life without ever touching the structural core underneath, something almost no other manufacturer in Britain could do. It also made the car dramatically stiffer and safer than anything else in its class. So secret was this project that Rover disguised prototypes on public roads under a fictitious brand name, Talago, just to stop rival engineers and the press from working out what was coming. Then came the brakes. Disc brakes on all four wheels years before that became anything close to standard, even on far more expensive cars. But Rover's engineers didn't stop at simply fitting them. On the rear axle, they made a decision that was almost unheard of on a road car of any kind. They mounted the rear discs inboard, next to the differential itself, rather than out at the wheels where every single other manufacturer on Earth kept them. This is the kind of solution you'd expect to find bolted to a Formula One car, not a saloon aimed at family buyers in Surrey. Moving that braking weight away from the wheels and in toward the centre of the car meant less unsprung mass bouncing around at each corner, which translated directly into sharper, more controlled handling that ordinary drivers could genuinely feel from behind the wheel. And that wasn't the only trick borrowed from the racetrack. At the rear, Rover fitted a Dion suspension system, a setup that keeps both rear wheels connected by a rigid tube while allowing the differential to stay fixed to the chassis rather than moving with the wheels. It's a design that lets both rear wheels stay planted and level through a corner in a way a simple live axle, the kind found in nearly every rival saloon, simply cannot manage. It was the kind of engineering you found in serious performance cars. Rover had put it under a family sedan. On paper and out on the road, this was without question one of the most sophisticated cars anyone in Europe had built for ordinary buyers. And the world noticed almost immediately. The press launch took place on the 8th of October 1963, and the reaction from Britain's motoring press was close to euphoric. One review ran under the headline, "Rover Revolution." Autocar called it one of the outstanding cars of the decade. Motorsport was equally impressed. Rover had spent an extraordinary £10 million developing the car, an almost unthinkable sum for the era, and the press seemed convinced every penny had been worth it. Then in 1964, that early praise turned into something far bigger. A brand new award had just been created, the European Car of the Year, the first of its kind anywhere on the continent, judged by a panel of motoring journalists from across Europe with no home bias and no marketing spin allowed near the vote. This was meant to crown the single best car built anywhere in Europe that year, full stop. And the contest for that very first trophy came down to what one retrospective would later call a two-horse race. On one side, Rover's plain understated 2000. On the other, the Mercedes-Benz 600, one of the most expensive, most technically serious cars Germany had ever built. A car that would go on to become the choice of heads of state and dictators around the world. When the judges finished casting their votes, the result stunned people who assumed Germany's engineering muscle would win by default. Rover's 2000 took the trophy with 76 points. Mercedes-Benz trailed behind with 64. In third place, another British car, the Hillman Imp, with 31. A saloon built by a company known for being safe and boring had just beaten the most curious automotive engineering nation in Europe in the very first year anyone bothered to keep score. For a moment, it looked like Rover could do no wrong, but underneath all that acclaim, a much quieter problem was starting to surface, one that had nothing to do with how the car drove and everything to do with what happened when something went wrong. Those inboard rear discs, the ones that made the P6 handle like nothing else in its class, turned a routine service job into something closer to mechanical surgery. On almost any conventional saloon, changing a rear brake pad meant pulling off a wheel and getting the job done in 20 minutes. On a PC6, a mechanic first had to remove the half shafts just to get anywhere near the brakes at all. What should have been a quick, cheap job could eat up the better part of an entire day. Multiply that by every independent garage in the country, the small local mechanics that ordinary British drivers relied on for decades, and you start to see the problem. Many of these garages had never encountered a system like this. Some didn't have the specialist knowledge to attempt it safely. Others simply didn't have the patience to spend a full day on a job that took 20 minutes on anything else rolling through their doors. The base unit construction created its own version of the same headache. A structure engineered for stiffness and safety hadn't been designed with quick, cheap crash repair in mind. A minor bump that would have meant a straightforward panel beating job on a traditional chassis and body car became a far more complicated, far more expensive fix on a P6, and body shops that didn't fully understand the construction sometimes made costly mistakes trying to force old techniques onto genuinely new engineering. And underneath the bonnet, there was a problem Rover's own engineers already knew about before the car ever launched. The P6 had originally been conceived with something far more radical in mind for its powertrain. Rover had been obsessed with gas turbine engines since the early 1950s, having built the world's first gas turbine-powered car back in 1950, a machine that went on to set a turbine land speed record on a public road in Belgium. Through the following decade, they kept pushing the idea further, showing turbine prototypes at motor shows in London and New York. And for a while, it genuinely looked like the P6 might be the car that brought turbine power to ordinary buyers. But a gas turbine is a nightmare to run in everyday traffic. It's ferociously thirsty at low revs, exactly the kind of driving a family saloon does constantly, crawling through towns and idling at junctions. So when the P6 finally reached the public in 1963, it launched instead with a conventional 2-litre 4-cylinder engine, a genuinely underpowered unit that struggled to match the ambition of everything else Rover had built around it. Here was a car with racetrack brakes, motorsport suspension, and a revolutionary chassis powered by an engine that couldn't fully take advantage of any of it. Word travels fast in a market built on trust and reputation passed between neighbours. A car that was harder to fix, harder to source parts for, more expensive to keep running, and underpowered to boot, started to build a quiet reputation. Not as a lemon exactly, something more specific than that. A car you needed to genuinely understand before you owned one, rather than something you could simply buy and forget about, the way you could with a Ford or a Vauxhall. For Britain's naturally conservative buyers, the same doctors and bank managers Rover had spent decades cultivating as loyal customers, that reputation mattered enormously. It's exactly why so many of the P6's genuine engineering breakthroughs never translated into the sales numbers or the lasting credit they arguably deserved. The car soldiered on regardless, and slowly, it started to become the car it was always meant to be. Production ran from 1963 all the way through to 1977, and across that 14-year run, Rover built more than 322,000 of them. In 1968, Rover finally solved the underpowered engine problem, and the solution came from an unexpected place. General Motors in America had developed a compact, lightweight aluminum V8 engine, then decided it was too expensive to manufacture at scale and shelved the entire design. Rover bought the rights to that abandoned engine outright, brought it back to Britain and dropped it into the P6, creating the 3500. Suddenly the car had the power to match everything else Rover had engineered into it 5 years earlier. The V8-powered P6 became a genuinely fast, genuinely capable executive saloon, one that finally delivered on the promise the 1964 Car of the Year judges had already seen coming. By the time production ended, the P6 had become something more than just a well-engineered car. It had become a kind of quiet, British institution. Its reputation for restrained, understated competence made it the natural choice for a very specific kind of fictional character, culminating in its role as the personal car of George Smiley, played by Alec Guinness in the BBC's adaptations of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. A car that looked utterly unremarkable on the outside, hiding exactly the kind of complexity and brilliance its driver understood better than almost anyone else in the room. That's the real story of the Rover P6, not a car that simply failed, and not a car that simply succeeded either, a car so far ahead of what British garages, British buyers, and even Rover's own engine department were ready for in 1963, that its own brilliance became its biggest obstacle. It beat Mercedes-Benz. It won the very first Car of the Year award Europe ever handed out, and it still had to fight its own reputation for over a decade to get the credit that win should have guaranteed instantly. Rover built the future. Britain just wasn't quite ready to service it. If you want more of the British engineering stories left behind by history, subscribe. We cover the forgotten side of British motoring every week, and if you want to see what happens when British engineers push an idea even further than the pace ever did, go watch our video on the car Aston Martin tried to forget ever existed.